Hello and welcome to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm here with Matthew Bunn, Associate Professor at the Kennedy School and the Principal Investigator at the Project on Managing the Atom. We're here to discuss the Nuclear Security Summit, which has taken place in Seoul, Korea. Matt, there was a huge gathering of world leaders this week to discuss nuclear security. What were the successes and surprises that came out of the summit?
Well, I think there were a package of relatively modest successes, but there were also, I think, some real challenges that led to some disappointments, at least from my perspective. The real successes were a number of countries announcing that they already had gotten rid of all the weapons usable material on their soil, or that they were going to get rid of particular stocks before the next summit in 2014. You had a broad consensus statement that more or less reaffirmed the commitments from the Washington Nuclear Security Summit 2 years ago. And a few new items, but not much in the way of real new commitments. The important commitments were coming out of the national statements by and large. Some of the disappointments, a lot of the national statements really didn't go as far as one might have liked. The United States and Russia, the two countries with 95% of the world's nuclear weapons and most of the world's weapons usable nuclear material, essentially issued statements that largely said what we're doing already is what we ought to be doing, and made very few new commitments. I think it was a real missed opportunity for Russia in particular, which has its nuclear stockpiles scattered in the world's largest number of buildings and bunkers, and they essentially committed to nothing to reduce that huge infrastructure for their nuclear weapons and materials, or even to upgrade security in their own country.
What can be done to overcome some of the obstacles that are now in place for nuclear security between now and 2014, when the next security summit is, which will be the last security summit? What can be done in the 2 years between now and the next one, and then beyond when the security summit process ends?
Well, I think it's very important to realize that while we're making real progress in improving nuclear security, for many of the highest risk stockpiles, there are security upgrades underway or they're being eliminated entirely. And the Belfer Center put out a report that outlined some of that progress just before the summit. While we're making that progress, it won't be true at the end of the 4-year effort that President Obama announced to secure nuclear materials, that all the nuclear material is secure and accounted for. So nuclear security is really something where we're going to have continual improvement, stretching for the long haul, for as long as nuclear weapons and materials continue to exist. Now, before now and the next summit, I think there's a lot that needs to be done to still work on overcoming the complacency and convincing states, number one, that nuclear terrorism is a real threat, and number two, that they in their country really need to do more to secure the nuclear materials that they have. Countries overwhelmingly feel, oh, what we're doing already is good enough. And in many cases, it's not. But I think there may be more that you can do with small cooperation between individual countries or between a group of countries than you can with a broad consensus summit statement with 50-plus countries involved. You might, for example, to be able to get a group of like-minded states to say, here's a high standard of nuclear security that we're all going to commit to meet, and we invite all other countries to join us in making that commitment, and we're prepared to help anybody who needs help in coming up to that high standard that we've agreed to.
What you're discussing there or mentioning there are sort of splinters or shoot-offs from the security summit process. Looking at the whole international framework for nuclear security, you've described it as a patchwork. There's a variety of different conventions and governing institutions, etc. What can be done on that front? Do we have any chance of trying to get some sort of unified international framework on nuclear security?
It would be great to have an overarching framework for nuclear security, but I think it's going to be very difficult to do. Countries have been very resistant to negotiating any kind of binding legal standards that would specify how secure a nuclear weapon or enough nuclear material to make a nuclear weapon should be. So I think, unfortunately, that we're going to be working with a patchwork of different initiatives for a while. I do think that between now and the next Nuclear Security Summit, we need to find some means of continuing the dialogue after the Nuclear Security Summit process comes to an end. We need some kind of high-level international forum where we can discuss nuclear security and the next steps that need to be taken that can be a driver of action in the way that the Nuclear Security Summit process has been.
So you've already discussed Russia very briefly. One of the other areas that you've identified as having high-risk nuclear stocks, not necessarily because of poor security, but because of the threats they face, is Pakistan. What next for Pakistan? They seem to be quite prickly about allowing international help, etc. What can we do on that front to help secure the material there?
Well, there has been major improvements in nuclear security in Pakistan over the past 15 years or so, including a substantial cooperation between Pakistan and the United States. But you're absolutely right that Pakistan remains extremely non-transparent about what they're doing. They are very concerned about protecting their nuclear stockpiles from Indian strikes or from U.S. seizure, as well as from violent Islamic extremists. And so they don't let, for example, U.S. experts actually go to their nuclear sites. I think in Pakistan there are still opportunities for expanded cooperation to improve security, but I think at the same time you need action to stabilize the government and reduce the capability of the adversaries in Pakistan, of the terrorist groups that are operating in Pakistan. I think there's no level of nuclear security you could get to that would result in a low risk if you didn't also constrain the threats those nuclear security systems are trying to protect against.
Can you talk a little bit about the threat and how it may have changed since the first Nuclear Security Summit, and how you see it evolving in the next few years? We've had U.S. leaders talking about al-Qaeda perhaps being on the verge of strategic defeat. We have the death of Osama bin Laden. Can you talk a little bit about that and its implications for nuclear security moving forward?
Well, I think there's really good news and some bad news. I think the really good news is that the risk that al-Qaeda itself would be able to put together a project as complicated as a nuclear bomb project probably has been substantially reduced. Not eliminated, but substantially reduced. Why do I say not eliminated? For example, the person who was in charge of their nuclear bomb project, which, by the way, progressed as far as actually carrying out tests of conventional explosives for their bomb in the desert in Afghanistan, he's still at large. Several of the other senior figures who were involved in that bomb project are still at large, and we have no idea where they are. But the bigger picture is that al-Qaeda is one of at least 2 and probably 3 terrorist groups that have seriously pursued nuclear weapons over the last 20 years or so. And with 2 or 3 groups having done that in the last 20 years, we can't expect that they will be the last. So the issue of nuclear terrorism remains a genuine threat, and that is a reason why we need to have continuing effort on nuclear security and a continuing focus on continual improvement in nuclear security. Now, the bad news is that I think many countries have reduced their feeling of urgency about this issue because of that progress in defeating al-Qaeda. And so we may have an even higher hill to climb to convince countries that they need to do more on nuclear security than they're doing today.
The final element of nuclear security that you've identified as being of biggest sort of concern and in need of large action is the presence of research reactors that use highly enriched uranium for fuel. Highly enriched uranium can also be used to fuel nuclear bombs. These research reactors are often at civilian facilities where they don't have as good or as strong security apparatus as military facilities. What did we see coming out of the summit in terms of research reactors, and what can be done next on that issue?
So one of the important steps that was taken on research reactors at the summit was an agreement between the United States and the Europeans to shift the production of medical isotopes from using highly enriched uranium targets to using low enriched uranium that can't be used in a nuclear bomb. So the big producers are South Africa, which has already begun the switch, Belgium and the Netherlands, which agreed to this switch in this summit statement, and Canada, which has not yet agreed to switch but is likely to shut down its medical isotope production reactors within a couple of years because they're very old. So that now will leave Russia, which is just coming into the market with isotopes made with highly enriched uranium, as the last remaining big producer using highly enriched uranium. So we need to work on Russia to convince them to convert that production, and so that we can end the use of highly enriched uranium for medical isotopes. What we didn't see is a lot of action on the places with the big quantities of nuclear material, with the exception of Ukraine, which announced that it had finally eliminated all of the HEU on its soil. So what I'd like to see as we move toward the next summit is a commitment from each country that has highly enriched uranium, plutonium, or nuclear weapons on its soil to examine in depth every single place where those stockpiles exist and say, do we still need this place? Is there a way we could do without it? Do the benefits of continuing to have this stuff at this place outweigh the costs and the risks of continuing to have that stuff? I think in particular, if we can convince countries to put stringent security requirements in place, that will, number one, provide more effective security that will be sustained for the long haul if it's legally required. And number two, it will drive up the cost of having highly enriched uranium or plutonium at your site and give facilities an incentive to get rid of that material wherever possible. That's happened in the United States, where there's been a huge consolidation of the number of places where there's highly enriched uranium or plutonium because our security regulations have driven the costs of maintaining that material so high.